Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome to our online debate with our guests, Shereen El Feki and Nina Farova. This event is part of the 12th annual Festival of Arab Culture, so-called ARABFEST, with the theme of love. Let me just briefly introduce our guests. Shereen El Feki, who is Regional Director for the Middle East and North Africa at UNAIDS and also author of Sex and the Citadel, Intimate Life in a Changing Arab World. And Nina Farova, who is a researcher at the Center for Gender and Science of the Institute of Sociology of the Czech Academy of Sciences. She focuses on ethnographic research into the Czech educational system, focusing on the issue of men and masculinity in a feminized context, and she is also a lecturer. I believe there is much more about both of these women, and you can find more and much more about Shereen and Nina on our website in the section program. Just some technical word from me. The debate will take approximately 40 minutes, and after that there is a room for Q&A. So please write your questions into the chat on our YouTube channel or in comments down below the link on our Facebook. And our guests, Shereen and Nina, will discuss it at the end. I'm Michala Vaňková. I'm from the Festival of Arab Culture, but this is not my event. This is event of Shereen and Nina. So now the floor is yours. I thank you very much for joining us today.
Thank you, Michaela. And Shereen, welcome once again. We are so happy to have you here. And as the topic of the ARABFEST is love, we will be discussing your book, Sex and the Citadel, and I'm so looking forward to it. But I think I can give you some space at this point if you want to say something to our listeners.
Well, thanks to you, Nina, for hosting this. I guess perhaps it's a translation from Czech, because Michaela, thanks to you and the excellent work you've been doing in organizing this very welcome cultural gathering of people who are perhaps informed about, but at least interested in aspects of Arab culture. So Michaela, the term you used was debate, and maybe that's a word in Czech. Because debate in English seems to suggest, ooh, there's going to be pro, there's going to be con, there's going to be fireworks. We're going to have a lively conversation, everyone, but it is a conversation. So we want to keep it constructive, we want to keep it engaged, and we want to hear your questions. And please don't feel shy, even very basic, Arab world sexuality 101 questions are great, because the basic questions are often the best ones to really get us thinking about the fundamentals. So thanks to everyone who's organized this call, and thanks to all of you who are joining in now. We hope we give you food for thought, and then we're looking forward to hearing your questions and comments later on in this session. So back to you, Nina.
Perfect, thank you very much. So I think we can jump in right now. So as I told you, we will be discussing your book, mostly Sex and the Citadel. So my first question is, what prompted you to write such a kind of book?
Interesting. So let me tell you something. So when this book came out, it was very interesting because it had a lot of global coverage, and in one Indian newspaper, they described me as a sexpert, which I think is a great term for what I do, and is sadly not a career option that my high school guidance counselor in Canada ever offered me. And I say that because I do want to talk a little bit about my background, because the way I came to this book was through my personal and my professional background. Personally speaking, I am Egyptian. My father is Egyptian, and my mother is British. It's very interesting. In the West, I describe myself as half Egyptian on my father's side, British on my mother's side. When I'm in the Arab world, it's very interesting. When I say I'm half Egyptian, And they say, oh, that means your mother is Egyptian. I said, no, 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 my father is Egyptian. And then they say, but that makes you 100% Egyptian, which is speaking volumes about the way we talk about nationality. We'll talk about that one later. So I grew up in Canada. I was born in Britain, raised in Canada, and we used to do trips back and forth to Egypt. And I never really thought about what it meant to come from the Arab world, to be a Muslim in the West, really until September 11th. And in September 11th, it became very clear that it wasn't really possible to sit on the fence anymore. And I was listening to a lot of people talking to me about those Arabs, those Muslims, and I realized that I actually had a privileged opportunity with a foot in both camps to really go and explore for myself. Now, why I chose sexuality as opposed to any other topic as my lens through which to understand my heritage and my culture is because of my professional training. So I'm an immunologist by background and not a sexpert, sadly. And one of my first jobs after graduating was with The Economist magazine. And I became the healthcare correspondent. And because I had a connection to the Arab region, because my responsibility was writing about HIV, the global AIDS epidemic, I started to be interested in HIV in the Arab world. And at that time, a lot of people would tell you, and even still today, they will say, HIV, not our problem in the Middle East. We are Muslims, we are Arabs, we don't do the things the Westerners do, therefore we are not vulnerable. And yet at the same time, I was meeting, whole families, frankly, that had acquired the infection. And then I realized that, there's a real gap here between what's actually happening and what people think is happening. And so that's how I came to sexuality, because the main route of transmission for HIV in the Arab world is sexual contact, heterosexual or same sex. And so it's a combination of the personal and the professional that brought me to spend 5 years in the first instance traveling around right across the Arab region, from Morocco in the west over to the borders of Iraq in the east, talking to people about sex. And frankly, I think there are worse ways to spend 5 years of your life.
Yeah, sure, definitely. I can imagine. I'm especially interested. I would like to talk more about the challenges that you encounter in doing your research. And I'm especially interested, how is possible to get research participants or like people you can talk to and make them talk about sex in the Arab world? Like, how did you accomplish that?
So it's very interesting. My problem at the end of the day wasn't getting people to talk about sex. It was getting them to stop talking about sex. And the reason for that is, of course, it's like anywhere in the world. And I think also just at this juncture, I'll make it quite clear that so much that what I say in the book is not unique to the Arab world. And it's not even unique to the global South. And so people have curiosity, people have questions. Now, in many cases, particularly for women, there's a lot of taboo and controls and constraints around women's bodies, and in particular their sexuality. And very often women, and I'm generalizing here, I need to also point out that the Arab world is vast and varied. It's 21 countries, it's 400 million people, it's different religions, different ethnicities. So I don't mean to homogenize here, but there are threads that run across. Generally speaking, women are often afraid. They have questions, definitely. But how can you ask them? Because, I'll give you an example. They're afraid of being judged. And so one of the women I interviewed for the book, and I interviewed hundreds of men and women across the region, but one woman, highly educated, scientist, she was getting married. Very excited, supposed to have sex before marriage. This is her big day. And so she was reading on the internet about, positions, things to mix it up a bit. And so she was like, so ready, so excited. And then, so when she was with her new husband, and she wanted to try a few new things, he hauled her out of bed and made her swear on a Quran that she didn't have any experience. So this is the price of curiosity, right? So when I come along and please tell me about your intimate life. On the one hand, what worked in my favor was that, I look Western. I mean, you can see me now. I tell people if I'm half Egyptian, half British, I'm British on the outside and Egyptian on the inside. It's very interesting. In the same way that Westerners have stereotypes about the sexual mores and practices and attitudes in the East, Middle Easterners have the same. So when they see a Westerner, they often think, Westerners are very open and free about sexuality. So when I fetched up, I look Western. And so people felt that they could talk to me without being judged. But the benefit of me coming from the region, speaking Arabic, being Muslim, meant that they also felt that I understood their culture. And so, this foot in both worlds could have been the worst of both worlds, but it actually turned out to be the best. And one of the things I have to say about all the hundreds of people I interviewed is that I'm enormously grateful to them, because they spent so much time with me and told me these incredibly personal, they trusted me with this incredibly personal information. And I'm grateful to them because those views are expressed in the book, and they have opened up conversations since the book has been published that many young people in particular around the world, not just in the Arab world, have written to me and said, you know what, Shereen, for the first time, I do not feel alone. It's interesting to see that there are other people. So it was surprisingly easy to get people to talk. I would say the only challenge really was in plain vanilla heterosexual men. So, and we can talk a little bit about this, but basically, it's not because they weren't willing to talk to me necessarily. It's just that they didn't have really very many interesting things to say, and the reason for it, I mean, it's like no blame or no judgment on them. It's just that they had never really had a chance to think about it in the way that we as women, culture makes us think about it. Biology makes us think about these issues. But yeah, no, I had some incredibly fruitful lots of fruitful conversations. I've never drunk so much Turkish coffee and eaten so much baklava in my life. I can tell you that it's a good thing I didn't get diabetes at the end of doing this book, but it was a very rich and rewarding experience.
Mm-hmm. I can imagine that women maybe could be more open with you, like as you are also a woman. Was that true, or?
It's interesting you say that. I mean, I've done subsequent research more directly related to gender, and when I've led very big research projects, and we can talk a little bit about this, looking into men and masculinities, one of the hallmarks of doing that sort of research is that you always have same-sex interviewers. What I would say is that it's very interesting, and this goes all the way back to those of you who know some of the history of the region and the interactions of Westerners with the region. There was a British woman, 18th century, called Lady Mary Wortley Montagu, and she was the wife of the ambassador to the Ottoman Empire. And she was one of the first people to really go into the harem and actually talk to women, because all the other accounts of women in the East were written by men who've never actually seen any of them. And she had a chance to go in and talk. And what's interesting, if you fast forward now, is that very often men will talk, they actually feel quite comfortable talking to women who come with a medical background. So because I was entering in using the lens of HIV, using the entry point, how should I put this? I would come in, I would be wearing my white coat of public health, HIV, and then they would let me in the door. And then we'd start having conversations, and then I'd take off my white coat, and then we'd talk about really detailed stuff. And I think that was also helpful to get men to talk. Now, the reverse is not true. So one of the problems for women is that, as a woman, as a medically oriented public health woman, I can talk to men. It doesn't work the other way. Men actually find it quite difficult to talk to women about these issues. And this is actually, just as an aside, this is a really big problem, because very often, even in the context of gynecology, very often male gynecologists are not broaching any of the key issues that, on sexuality that they need to be talking to their female patients. So again, it worked in my favor.
That sounds always so interesting. I have so many questions, but we will move on a little bit and we will go deeper to the book itself. So what would you say are the key challenges at the heart of the sexuality in the Arab world?
Wow, interesting one. Just to actually maybe take a step back and to tell people a little bit about the book. So the book is organized. Basically, I'll maybe talk a little bit about the Citadel, because actually that relates to the point. Well, why the title? Okay, so Sex in the Citadel, Sex in the City. There's clearly trying to, hoping that Netflix will do, or HBO will do the series of my book. So there's a resonance there. But actually, the Citadel is, anyone who's visited Cairo will know that the Citadel is a fortress. And it's a really major landmark in Cairo, and it has a mosque in the center. And it was built by Salah ad-Din during the medieval period, early medieval period, and it was, a symbol of Arab power. It's the good old days when actually the Arabs actually had the upper hand on the West. And we have citadels across the region. And essentially, I use the Citadel as a metaphor to talk about the structure of sexual life. In a sense, the only socially accepted, legally binding, religiously sanctioned, family approved form, context for sexual activity is heterosexual, heteronormative marriage. Has to be approved by your family, registered with the state, approved religiously. That's it. Anything else, anything outside that is haram, forbidden, naive, shameful. We have a whole lexicon of words to describe things that are sort of beyond the pale in terms of behaviors in Arabic. So that Citadel is in a sense, it's like a fortress. That's where we put sexuality, in the Citadel. Now, the problem today in the Arab world is that there are increasing numbers of people who are outside that Citadel at any one time. And the book goes through that. So the book talks about what's happening inside the Citadel, that's sex within marriage. And then it looks at all the populations outside. So that's single people, we're not supposed to be having sex, clearly are. That includes female sex workers, that includes LGBTQ populations. And that's the real challenge, because when you have these people outside the Citadel, how are they going to realize their fundamental sexual and reproductive rights? And so my book, looks at the possibilities. I mean, there are two ways of dealing with this. One, you can storm the Citadel. Okay, you can try to attack it from the outside and pull it down. I think it's quite clear from the trajectory and the outcomes of the Arab Spring that those uprisings don't end well for us in the Arab region. What I discuss in the book is how do you open the Citadel? How do you take it further, make it bigger and bigger so it's protecting other populations? And that, I think, is possibly a more productive way forward. So I would say that in that context, I would say that the key challenge here is really, it's the gap between appearance and reality. So what people are concerned about, and this is not just true of intimate life, this is across the board, it's not what you're doing, it's what you're seen to be doing. And that's problematic, because when you have a gap between the reality and the appearance, then all sorts of stuff can come in the middle. I don't know if you don't mind, Nina, can I just give another story to illustrate what I mean?
Sure.
Okay. So as part of my HIV work, I was in Casablanca, Morocco. We're not doing well on HIV in the Arab region. We're one of two regions where HIV is still going on the rise. We have the lowest rates of testing and treatment in the world. It's a challenge. Anyway, in Morocco, they have actually one of the few countries in the region which takes HIV seriously and really has done quite a lot to try to reach out to vulnerable populations. Among them are female sex workers. So I was with an NGO, a great local organization that is, trying to provide, prevention, testing, treatment, trying to help people in need. We were out on the town one night in Casablanca, and we were going to bars, and these community workers, really brave, were handing out condoms and lubricant, and giving information about safe sex. And we went into this bar, and we met two young women, and started talking to them. They were hairdressing students, early 20s. They were turning tricks, so engaging in sex work, in order to make money for, mobile phone, nice clothes, that sort of thing. When the community workers tried to offer them condoms, it was very interesting. These young women said to us, no, we do not need condoms because we want to get married, and therefore we need to have an intact hymen. Therefore, there's no chance of us getting pregnant because we only engage in anal, basically anal and outer course, because we want to be virgins to get married. And so that raises a really interesting question, because the way that they defined virginity was an intact hymen. That's appearance. The reality, of course, these young women were doing everything, right? And in between that appearance and reality, in comes HIV. And that's why we really do need to bring the two closer together. And that's the big challenge. And it relates, we'll talk a little bit about how this relates to political life, but I think it's an important goal to reconcile these two inside the bedroom, but also outside the bedroom.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. That's really interesting. Yeah, different conceptualization of sex and what sex does mean, and yeah, that's really interesting. I think we not we in the West, that is too general, but I mean, like, if we don't have experiences with Arab cultures, we can also think about it in very stereotypical way and in very, very different way. Yeah. Can you see any similarities comparing to West when we are talking about sex, sexual behavior, sexual experiences, something that is maybe not universal, but something that we share?
Again, I think the West is a big place, as you mentioned, and it's very diverse. I come from Canada. I grew up in Canada, which we're an immigrant society, so it's hard to say what is Canadian, really, let alone what is global. I think one of the biggest distinctions that you see, I'll talk about differences first and then similarities. One of the biggest distinctions you see, I think, is still the primacy of marriage. So that's a really big difference. In most Western countries, you can see that in some Western European countries, marriage is now the minority of contexts in which people are building their adult lives and clearly engaging in sexual activity and having children as well. I would say that, and the reason for that, the primacy of marriage in the Arab world is in part religious, and we'll come to that in a moment, because I think it's important to talk about the role of Islam, but it's also partly political as well. You have patriarchies here. You have political patriarchies, whether it's the military head of the state or the emir or the sultan, and so in these patriarchies, when you have these patriarchal political systems, they're mirrored in personal life as well. So you have the father of the nation married and the father of the family. And so it becomes very important. Marriage is like the satellite. It's an important tool that the political system uses. That's why they're all the pro-family, pro-natalist, all that sort of thing. So I think the marriage piece is important, is different. I think also the primacy, I think another difference, and again, I'm generalizing here, but the West is also virginity. The double standards. So clearly, the one thing we do share are double standards, right? It's pretty clear in the West as well. But I think virginity has a bigger, more prominent role, and the importance of virginity, again, the appearance of virginity, as I said before, but that is still a much more important criteria, which has to do with the control of female sexuality. And that it exists in the West as well, but I think it's less pronounced. And I need to, it's very, virginity is I use this phrase in my book. Virginity is a big fucking deal in the Middle East, and we have all sorts of ways of enforcing it. I'll tell you another story. Another another woman from the region, also highly educated. Right, we have this.
So I think we lost Shereen, if I see it correctly. So we can wait. We will wait. Hopefully she join us pretty soon. I think she's in Cairo now, and she discussed with us that she can have some problems with the connection.
Sorry about technical issues, but as Nina said, that Shereen is in Egypt and it's a little bit far away from Prague. I don't know, Nina, if you don't want to share the video with us, or no. Shereen is here, I guess.
Yeah.
So we can wait for her. Thank you.
Hi, everyone. Hi, sorry about that.
No worries.
Sorry, I'm back. Sorry, I'll try and get my internet just died in Cairo. Welcome to life in Cairo. As soon as it comes back up, I'll switch off my phone. Anyway, sorry everyone. But anyway, this point I was making about some of the distinctions. So yeah, so in the Arab world, very much, it's still, although we have all these constitutions and these laws which are supposed to be guaranteeing individual freedoms and rights and all that, the reality is that we live in collective cultures. It's your tribe, it's your family. And one of the elements around virginity is that when you have this collective culture, it's really the honor, which is another interesting concept, which is different to what you find in the West. The honor of the family is also dependent on the virginity of the daughters. So you are a good family because you have essentially raised your daughter in such a way that you are delivering to the groom a virgin bride. And there are all sorts of ways that we try to, families try to reinforce this. Female genital mutilation is actually related to this because it's thought to cool women's sexual ardor, clip her wings, as we say in Arabic, and therefore she will be not inclined to have sex before marriage. We have, hymen repair happens. It's another way that you try to give it's the personal honor and the family honor. Anyway, this woman I was telling you about. Okay, so she is again highly educated. Her father's a lawyer. She's getting married. The father starts calling the groom to be and saying, right, on the wedding night, I want you to put what we call the sheet of honor. It's like a towel. And when you penetrate, when the hymen is broken and she bleeds, we will collect that. And then it proves positive to your family, to our neighbors, doesn't matter who, that we, upheld the honor of the family. Okay. So, this is the 21st century. So he's starting to get, really quite anxious about this. And come the wedding night, he this poor, again, it cuts both ways. I mean, the emphasis on virginity and this proof, like the sheet of honor, is not only about delivering a virgin bride, it's also about male potency. It's about performance. She is performing her virginity and he is performing his virility. Anyway, this poor young man was so rattled that by the time they got to the bridal suite,
he actually suggested that they go out and see a movie instead. This, of course, created such an uproar because, you know, you're supposed to be, this is it, you're supposed to be having sex on your wedding night. So that became a huge family deal as well. Anyway, the only way that this poor couple could consummate their marriage is that because the father-in-law is now also sending him texts, I mean, SMS messages. The only way he managed to do this is, bright idea, turned off his phone. The next day, her family came to collect the sheet of honor. So virginity is still a big deal. Now, what I would say, what binds us together, East and West, is the desire to have a safe and satisfying and fulfilling sexual life. That's universal. I mean, these are the fundamentals of sexual rights, and they're not some Western import, as some conservatives in the Arab region would have you think. No, these are universal. These are universal rights. These are universal needs. These are universal desires. Now, how you go about fulfilling that can vary from region to region. You know, it's very interesting how people think of sexual freedom in many Arab countries as compared to the West. When I talk to many young women, for example, about, you know, what does sexual freedom mean to you? They wouldn't talk about having sex before marriage, because to them, according to the religion, you're supposed to be a virgin on your wedding night. What they said was not the freedom to have sex; it was the freedom to control their own bodies. That my hymen, for example, is my business and it's not anyone else's. So I would say that we are bound together by this universal need. Now, and universal desire, but how we choose to fulfill it can look very different from place to place.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Yeah, and that's connected to the next question, because as you touch it a little bit, that the religion is pretty important when we speaking about sex and sexuality in Arab countries. So we can see that there is a perception, particularly in the West, that Islam is against sexuality. But for example, I saw some interviews with you and read something from your book. And I also read this book that I got from the director of this festival, Teresa. And the book is, there are texts like 400 years old, and they are about sex in Arab countries. So what do you think? Like, do you agree with the opinion that Islam is against sexuality?
Very interesting point of discussion. And what I'm going to do now is try to relaunch my my Zoom connection on my computer, so we can talk about this face to face, everyone. And if I drop off, it's not because I'm trying to avoid answering this question. It's just because my computer is not cooperating. So hold on.
Okay.
Let's see what we can do here. Hold on.
Sure.
Okay. Bear with me, everyone.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. Do we have a connection? Okay. Not looking promising here. All right, let me answer that.
Yeah. No, it's fine. I think.
Hold on.
Mm. There is a huge echo. Yeah, now it's just one of you.
I haven't cloned myself in the meantime.
Yeah. How do you do it?
Tricks of the trade. No, okay. So let's talk about the really important point about religion. And by religion, I'm going to talk here about Islam, okay? But there are many other faiths. You need to remember, cradle of our Middle East and North Africa, cradle of Islam, Christianity, Judaism. But I'm going to speak mainly in a Muslim context here. Yes, the idea that Islam is anti-sex is quite interesting and not surprising, because I mean that's the official line now. That it's very interesting. For example, when I'm involved in these high-level UN negotiations around various political declarations on HIV or aspects of reproductive health, it's always the people from the Muslim majority countries that are saying, "Oh no, we can't sign on to that because it's it's un-Islamic, et cetera, et cetera." I mean, it's very interesting because if you go back to the basics of Islam is pro-sex.
And it's very interesting. Our core texts, the Quran, and also the Sunnah, which are the sort of accounts of the sayings and the actions of the Prophet. I mean, many of you will know this as one element of Sunnah is Hadith. So these sayings that encapsulate the Prophet's life. It's very interesting because at that level, Islam is very pro-sex. In fact, Islam realizes or recognizes that sex is such a powerful force that you need to channel it, because if you don't control it, it will lead to something called fitna, which is confusion. And so Islam had channels in which they tried to control this, like this raging torrent of human energy. One of those channels is marriage. But it's very interesting because if you look at the history of the Arab region, and it really speaks volumes as to we're in the situation where we're very constrained and censored about sexuality and talking about sexuality today. But if you're absolutely right, Nina, if you go back 1,000 years and you look at the writings, we were the masters of sex. This is what many people don't know. And they don't even know this in the Middle East and North Africa, because many of these classic books have been lost out of sight. They're not translated into Arabic, or they're written in an Arabic that's really inaccessible. It's like Old English, for example. And so most a younger generation simply can't read it, can't find it. But if you go back to these books, and it's really fascinating that 1,000 years ago, that there is literally nothing in the seminal texts of the sexual revolution, Joy of Sex, Cosmopolitan, fast forward even 50 Shades of Grey, that they weren't talking about 1,000 years ago in Baghdad. And these books cover absolutely everything you could imagine. I mean, they go extensive discussions, for example, about same-sex relations, a very, very nuanced understanding of human sexuality, which has basically been, lost in much of the modern discourse around sexuality in the Arab world today. And what's interesting about that is that many of these books were written by what we would call the ulama, religious scholars, because they saw nothing incompatible between fulfilling the needs of the flesh and the needs of the faith. And sex was very much seen as a gift from God, and we are meant to enjoy it. It's very interesting. The cover of my book, in one, it's the German edition, actually, the French edition, and in Canada as well, and in Holland. So most of the European editions of my book, I'm sorry, I don't have a copy with me. They have a woman's body in calligraphy. It's very beautiful, and it was done by an Iraqi calligrapher. And interestingly, I'll tell you a bit about him because it relates directly to love. He did a wonderful. His name is Wissam Shaukat, and he did a wonderful exhibition on the 99 names, 99 words for love, a couple of years ago in calligraphy. Anyway, this piece of calligraphy, and those of you who know Arabic calligraphy will know calligraphy is made up of words, but this particular picture is made up of some of the words for sex, because there is an 11th, 12th century dictionary in Arabic that included 1,083 verbs for to have sexual intercourse. So there is this real celebration of sexuality. And what's really interesting about these historical texts is that also they celebrate women's sexuality. And in fact, there's a very interesting hadith, which the prophet the prophet said that God created 99. God created 10 parts of desire, and he gave 9 of those parts to women and 1 part to men. So in Islam, traditionally, female sexual drive is seen as much, much stronger than male sexual drive, which interestingly also explains a lot of the controls we have on women's sexuality, because men are really historically quite frightened of sexed up women. And if you go into these books, these historical texts, they have endless chapters on lotions and potions and all sorts of things that men can do to up their game in bed. And fast forward to the 21st century, and in some parts of the Middle East, still, if you want to get stuff done. I mean, if I fetch up to a government ministry and let's say I need some paperwork, the best way I can get that is by actually providing a bribe of Viagra. So, men are really anxious about being able to realize women's sexual needs. And so the problem is not Islam about when it comes to sexuality. The problem are Muslims. I mean, we are the problem. And that's very much connected to the politics. And this is not just true in the Arab world. I mean, political conservatives, even looking in the United States around debates about abortion, or in Eastern Europe, in Poland, around questions of abortion as well. Conservatives, no matter where they are in the world, will take sex, they will wrap it in religion, and they will use it as a tool of control. And the point I make to people here in the region is that the religious conservatives will tell you it's black and white. Well, it isn't black and white when it comes to sex. There are at least 50 shades of gray on these issues, even issues that are as incandescent as same-sex relations. So it's unfortunate that this is the case, but one of my central arguments in the book is that Islam does give us space. There is freedom to maneuver, but we have to want to find that freedom and we have to want to exercise it.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. So if you're speaking about the freedom and the choice and what the people want and what they should do, we can talk about it more about what has changed. Like you did the research more than 10 years ago, if I am right. So what has changed during this time? Is it any different now?
I would say that the difference, okay, so trying to figure out what the difference is actually interesting because we don't have the sort of robust research that you see elsewhere in the world about sexual knowledge, attitudes, behaviors, and practices. Anyone who's on this call who works in development will know about KABP, these sort of surveys. There's no Kinsey report for the Middle East. Right? So we don't have anything really quantitative, robust, and not empirical in that respect. So unless you have a baseline, how do you really know how things are changing? But I'll speak anecdotally. I think that there is more space for conversations about sex. And this is largely to do, in part, with the expansion of social media in the region. And I know this is your area. I mean, I would love to talk to you about, get a Czech perspective on how social media and new technologies are shaping sexual life in your part of the world. But I would say that access to social media and a more openness that has come from the Arab Spring has led to really very interesting conversations online. And there are a lot of new initiatives to provide, for example, information. We don't have comprehensive sexuality in any of our countries in public schools, but we are seeing conversations and new information, in a sense, hearkening back to the good old days, as it were, 1,000 years ago when we did talk about sex in Arabic, that are opening up space to provide factual information, up-to-date information, and answer questions and allow people to have conversations. This is happening online. We have more civil society groups, NGOs, that are trying to deal with the tough stuff. Excuse me. For example, we have NGOs now that are working in the LGBTQ space. Definitely not easy in our region. We have fantastic NGOs that are, trying to find a space for unwed mothers, for example. We have NGOs that are trying to advocate for increased rights to abortion. So there's a lot happening, and sexual violence is also a busy space of civil society groups. But so there are little things happening all over the place, and that's great. The problem, in my experience, is that these are like bubbles, all right? They exist in a context. The bubbles are getting bigger, so there are more people involved, but it's still a bubble. And it frankly only takes one prick and it all collapses. And so the question is, how do we scale up these initiatives, and how do we make them both scalable but also sustainable? And that's the real challenge. So, I mean, over to you, Nina, in terms of what you see on your side in terms of how social media is shaping in particular young people's approaches to sexuality? Is it opening space? Is it causing new problems? What does it look like?
I think in Europe, especially, it's definitely like broadening the experience what people can have. Definitely, there is definitely a positive trend, because if people can use these apps and like different appliances for get some friends or partners, they are using it and it's working very well. But I think it's pretty different situation if we compare it to the region you were doing the research. Yeah.
I mean, I think the challenge really is, as I said, how do you, I mean, it's great that you have these conversations. It's great that you have this information, but then really, you know, and it's very interesting because one of the big distinctions in the Arab world is, remember I said, is what you're doing and what you're seen to be doing. Very often things are happening in private. You just don't want to show it in public. And I'll just give you an example of this. It relates to gender, but it's also true to sexuality. When I did work on men and masculinities, I led a big set of studies in this region on what does it mean to be a man in the Arab world. And it's very interesting because among the interviews we did, there was a couple who said that, so they have the husband does the laundry. He washes the clothes. And this is unusual. You know, we have very, gendered division of labor in the home. But the reason he does that is because they have a new washing machine. It's a machine. It's technical. It was expensive. He paid for it. And so I'm going to do the laundry. But they didn't have a dryer. So you have to put clothes on the line. And he would never do that because the line is on the balcony. And the balcony is overlooked by the neighbors. And therefore, the neighbors would see him doing something that he isn't supposed to be doing according to the convention, right? So again, this comes back to appearance and reality, right? And so I think the challenge here is really, I mean, how do we take these online conversations? Because the internet, the social media is a funny space. It's like a halfway house, isn't it? It's sort of private, but then it's also sort of public as well. And we have real problems in the region. I mean, we have a huge difficulty in some parts of the Arab world of this internet blackmail. I mean, girls are online, talking on whatever social media platform they're using, and then the videos are used to blackmail them because yes, you felt that you had this freedom in cyberspace, but then actually in the real world, the fact that you spoke freely or did something online in this so-called private space, it becomes very public. And then you're subject to the rules of the game in public life. And again, I come back to the point I made earlier. We need to bring appearance and reality closer together. Yeah, I mean, it's interesting what you're talking about. The West, your part of the world, because the point I keep making is that we're all on a spectrum of sexual dysfunction. No place is a paradise. And I think what's really interesting, when the book first came out a decade ago, as you rightly point out, almost a decade ago, I was asked endless questions about sexual harassment, right? And it was around Tahrir Square, and there have been lots of cases of women being raped during the uprisings. And, there was this framing of the Arab man is violent, is a sexual predator. And it's a trope that goes all the way back 1,000 years, basically. There's nothing new in it. And then it got reinforced in Europe with the Syrian migrants, right? With the refugees, because then they were framed in this way. It's very interesting that the moment the hashtag #MeToo movement started, no one was asking me those questions anymore. I would go into media interviews and no one would be framing it that way. Because I think there was a realization at that point that we're all on the spectrum of sexual dysfunction, frankly, and there's nothing exceptional about any part of the world.
Yeah, that's true. I think that changed the world in a very huge way, like also in Europe, in US, and it's glad to hear that also in Arab countries. Shereen, we have as we talked earlier, we wanted to play some video, but we are a little bit behind the schedule, and we have some very, very interesting questions in the chat from our audience. So what do you think? I think it will be go through these questions because people are really interested in what you wanted to say or add. So what do you think?
That sounds good. Look, we'll do the questions, because thank you for your patience, everyone, for listening to this conversation. And it's great that you're now being engaged. So let's tackle your questions. And then I think it would be good, maybe we close with a video, because I think it would give you.
Yeah, that's a good idea. Yeah, perfect. So the first question is, do Arabic Islamic parties use the theme of LGBTQ community in their political programs? Is LGBTQ community seen by these parties as a fashion trend or part of influence of the West?
Okay. Yeah. Yeah. And again, so the region is. Thank you for your question. Very interesting. The region is highly diverse. So Islamist parties have different stripes in different places, and they tend not to talk about LGBTQ unless something happens. Basically, there's an incident. And they don't. And I need to point out, you don't need to be Islamist, like card-carrying member of the Muslim Brotherhood, in order to have conservative views on sexuality, on LGBTQ. And so let me give you an example. In Qatar, okay, many of you may know Qatar. It's a small country on the Persian Gulf. It's home to Al Jazeera. It is also, in about 6 months' time, going to be home to the World Cup. Right. So there has been a really interesting debate going on about what happens to LGBTQ fans who go to Qatar, and some people in Qatar have said that, come as you are, basically, everyone's welcome. But then other more conservative people have said, this is against our traditional values. This is against our morals as Muslims. No, don't do any exhibitionism. Again, fine if you want to keep it private, okay, but just don't go public with it. And we cannot change our values and our traditions for a month's worth of football, basically. So I would say that very often, and I think your question is coming to this, it's really interesting. Yes, very often when Islamist parties or conservatives of any stripe want to make a point and they want to earn, they will go after LGBTQ populations in a way that they would not do about women's rights, all right? Quite simply because they realize that, we want to look good also in the international community, and women's rights movements are very well organized, and this could be problematic from a strategic standpoint, whereas who's going to defend LGBTQ populations in our region? So they wouldn't go out of their way to use it, but if something crops up, then they will weigh in. And the good example of that was in Egypt. I mean, we a couple of years ago, there was a concert by a group called Mashrou Leila. Really, by the way, anyone who is not familiar with them, fantastic Lebanese indie band. Their lead singer is openly gay. Unusual, highly unusual in the region. Some Egyptians were waving a rainbow flag, and whoops, they ended up in prison. Now that's from a government which is actually persecuting the Muslim Brotherhood, frankly. They're busy putting them in prison. So as I said, you don't have to be Islamist, but in general, the framing is that this is somehow a Western idea that's being foisted on us. Now, again, go back to the history. We were talking very frankly, very freely, and very encouragingly about same-sex relations 1,000 years ago. And there were good Muslims back then too. Yeah, I hope that answers your question.
Okay, so the next question is, in the Middle East, there is a long tradition of several transitional rituals associated with adolescence and sexuality. Do you think that these rituals will be performed in the future, or will they disappear due to the increasing education and emancipation of Arabic women?
These are fantastic questions. You are an extremely informed and thoughtful audience. Thank you for all this. So again, some of these rituals, I talked about it, dakhla, which is one of them, the performativity of virginity for women. FGM, female genital mutilation, is par excellence one of those. There are rituals in North Africa. I talk about them in my book called tasfiyah, which is a way of trying to keep girls' virginity. So I would say related to that, I mean, FGM, tasfiyah, by the way, is disappearing. It's just not a practice. It's actually a generational issue. As it becomes less common, there are few people who know how to perform it, and therefore it just sort of withers on the vine. FGM is an interesting case. So FGM, I'm speaking to you from Cairo. FGM is very common here. According to the last estimates, about 90% of women in Egypt have been circumcised. If you look at a younger generation, it's about 60%. And these are the 15 to 19-year-olds. The form of FGM we do in Egypt is what's called type 1. It's excision of the clitoris and a bit of the labia. It's not as invasive as some of the forms that you see further south in Sudan, for instance, where they do infibulation. There have been, hundreds of millions of dollars, decades of investment in trying to eradicate FGM in Egypt. And why, and on current trends, we're not likely to see it eradicated until the next century. And actually, it's interesting, COVID actually has made things a little more complicated and has actually, in some cases, increased the rates of FGM. It is interesting, in the efforts to eradicate FGM, you have to be really, really careful how you go about doing this. So one of the early arguments that was used in Egypt to get women to stop, women and men, families, to stop circumcising their daughters was that, you know what, girls could die. Girls do die. And it's unsafe. And FGM was practiced by what were called the daya, the traditional midwife. So, don't do it, your girl could die. So it's very interesting, that argument went out. And then what people said, ooh, my girl could die if I have it done by a midwife. I better take her to a doctor. So now 75% of circumcisions, female circumcisions in Egypt, are done by medical professionals, healthcare professionals. So whoops, there we go. That argument didn't work. Next argument is now that's emerging is about sexuality. FGM will limit a woman's ability to experience sexual pleasure. It's one of her fundamental rights, recognized in Islam, by the way, in the context of marriage, and diminish the couple's sexual fulfillment. The problem with that argument is twofold. I mean, it's absolutely true, but the problem is that the evidence for that is, at least coming out of here, is a little tricky, because very often women conceptualize of sexual pleasure a bit differently. If it's, I'm sexually satisfied if my husband is sexually satisfied, right? So whether I'm reaching orgasm or not is neither here nor there. The other problem with that, and I'll just tell you a story that relates to this about connecting FGM to sexuality, is so again, it's done largely. It's done because it's not done because parents want to be cruel to their daughters. It's done because they think that it will protect them and give them a better chance of getting married and getting inside the Citadel, which is a place you want to be. You don't want to be outside the Citadel. So it will curb their sexual desire. And it's very interesting. There was a conversation with a group of men, and the men said, we must do FGM on the girls, on our women, because it controls their sexual desire. And we tried to explain, no, you know what, not really, and like the biology. And they turned and said, you know what? How can you say that? In these Western porn films that we watch, there are threesomes. I mean, there's a woman having sex with two men. And we know Western women are not circumcised. So look, this is what will happen if our girls are not circumcised. So the point I'm trying to make here is that, people are engaging in FGM and these sort of rituals from it's not superstition. They're doing it for what they consider to be logical reasons. Now, their frame of logic is completely different to the way we in the West would see it. But we have to acknowledge that they're not irrational. Give them another basis, give them the information and the motivation to make a different rational decision, and they will do it. And that's the key to eradicating these practices. And we're starting to see some impact on FGM. But the other key point on a lot of these rituals is that for as long as you just talk to the women, the mothers and the grandmothers and the aunts and the daughters, it can only get you so far. What you really need to be doing is talking to the men in their world. Because now the newer research, part of which I led here in looking at men's roles in Arab life, is that men actually do have a role in decision-making around FGM, but almost all of the campaigns have been directed to women. So now they're starting to talk to men. So I would say I'm cautiously optimistic, but these are social norms that we need to change. And anyone who's worked in this space anywhere in the world knows that it's not enough to change a law, and it's not enough to just provide information. You have to provide a motivation, and then it still takes time to change social norms.
Mm-hmm. As you are speaking about the pornography, there is also a question connected to that. So the question is, can you compare the role of pornography in the Arab world and in the Western world? Does the taboo of pornography in the Muslim world cause more interest in it?
Very interesting. So according to all the Google metrics, the most searched for word coming out of the Arab region is sex, basically, or gins in Arabic. I mean, we appear to be, obsessed. So pornography is prevalent, as it is anywhere in the world. We don't really have good quality porn, like domestic production of porn. Most of the porn that people are watching tends to be, Western. It's the stuff that comes up on, if you're looking at professional productions, or it's amateur stuff, right? And so I would say that it is pornography anywhere in the world, particularly for young people, does have a distortive effect. It has a distortive effect on what men expect from women, and also for women what they think is expected of them. And I don't think that's any different here. I think that it can cause different sorts of problems because of some of the sexual practices. So it's very interesting here in the Arab world, or historically, in these encyclopedias of sexuality, which talked about everything under the sun, really fantastic books. It's very interesting. Oral sex really doesn't feature. It's not really it's not a prominent part of the Arab sexual canon historically in our region. Although it's permitted. There are some religious scholars who say it's forbidden, but most say within marriage it's fine. And so I have met women who feel deeply uncomfortable and are really worried about where their marriages are heading, because their husbands will say, I want such and such a practice, particularly with release oral sex, and they don't feel comfortable with it. They feel that somehow it's haram, or they're going to be judged, or it's just wrong. And the other problem is that often men are, again, I'm generalizing here, but many men I've met who are watching porn, it increases their desire for a more varied repertoire of sexual experience. But they often, again, because of the judgment of women, remember I told you about the woman who was hauled out of bed and made to swear on the Quran, they can't even imagine asking their wives for that. So many sex workers I've spoken with, when I ask them, why do your clients come to you? They will say, well, very often because they feel freer and they can ask for things that, for example, they've seen in pornography that they just think they can't ask of their wives. Because not only would it be really, what if my wife said yes? What would that be saying about her? So it has these distortive effects. I think one of the issues in the Arab world is that because we don't have formal sexuality education, where else are people getting their information? This is the problem. At least in most of the West, you have options of where you can get insight and information. You have people to talk to who are informed. That's not always the case in the Arab world.
I also have one question about different religious communities. If people belonging to different religious communities could get married without any limitations, and if Cyprus is still a most wanted place to get married if you are from different religious community?
Interesting question. We don't have civil marriage in countries in the Arab region. As a consequence, marriage is either explicitly or implicitly religious. And so you need to marry within your own confession. So this is Lebanon is the example that you're talking about, where you need, if you're a Christian and a Muslim who want to get married, you need to go to Cyprus to do that, because you cannot marry within the country. It will not be recognized if you marry outside. COVID has been deeply problematic for that. So yes, this was a very popular option before COVID. We'll see what happens as we bounce back from that. But marriage laws, there's very little movement on that at the moment in most countries in the region.
And there is a last question. What is young women's awareness of sex life before wedding?
Yeah, again, I would say that young women are actually probably better informed than young men, interestingly. In the surveys that we've done, on the very limited surveys we've done, particularly in the context of HIV, what you find is that when you ask young women, where are you getting your information about sex? They'll say, oh, I talked to my aunt, I talked to my older sisters, I had some cousins. So they might have a slightly better idea of what's happening. By the way, women are talking about sex all the time in private circles, and men are talking about sex all the time as well. The problem is when you try to bring men and women together, and then when you try to take the discourse into the public domain. The interesting thing about these surveys is when you ask young men where they're getting their information, they're not talking to their parents, they're not talking to older, more experienced people in their family, they're talking to their friends. So it's like the blind leading the blind, basically. I think the issue is not so much what women know, and it's not enough, definitely. I've talked about these sites that are available. And again, when we don't have comprehensive sexuality education, there's a limit to how easily you can find information. I think the question for women is, even if you know, what are you going to do with that information? How can you exercise it? Back to the story I told first. And for as long as there is judgment, and this comes back to a really central issue, which is about collective cultures. Sexual rights and reproductive rights are all about individual rights. But as one LGBTQ activist in Lebanon said to me, Shereen, you're talking about sexual rights and reproductive rights and my right to be, a gay person. How can I even exercise those rights when I don't exist as an individual in the eyes of the state? In the state records, I am registered as the daughter of my father. And if I were to marry, I would be the wife of my husband. You tell me how I'm going to exercise those rights in any way if I'm not seen as a person, as an individual entity. And I think that is at the heart of a lot of the issues that we have around sexuality. And it speaks to your question about what do women know? How freely can women act? There will not be sexual freedom until you are free as an individual, until you can make decisions for yourself and take responsibility for your decisions. And we are a long way from that in the Arab region. And I'll just bring this back to politics. These questions of transparency and accountability, of bringing appearance and reality closer together, no country has this. No country has this right 100%. But it is a greater hallmark of a democracy than it is of a dictatorship. And that is why everything I'm talking about here, everyone thinks it's sex, it's not important, it's a sideshow. Sex is central to our existence as human beings. It is central in an evolutionary sense to our continuation as a species. But more than that, these fundamental elements of sexual life, about tolerance, about respect, about communication, for instance, about accountability, about diversity. These are all the things that we want to see in our political lives. And that's why sex matters. Because if we can sort of figure this out in private life, we will start asking for it in public life as well. Those of you who are living in Europe, talk to your parents, talk to your grandparents. They will have told you about the revolutions across, the sexual revolution, the May 68 in France, the uprising of youth, where the slogan was, the personal is political. this is exactly what we're talking about here as well. Sex matters. Don't let anyone tell you that it's not important. There are bigger issues or more important issues to address. This is at the core of who we are. And that is why conservatives try to control it, because they know how powerful it is.
Yeah, and it's connected what you were saying in one of the interviews I saw, that we need to speak about freedom or equality or intimacy in our private life, and then we can take these conversations and take these imaginaries and go with them to the public space, to the public sphere.
Absolutely. I mean, the point I often make is, look, in the Arab countries, for example, I mean, big, lots of efforts now on women's empowerment. Women must be in politics. Women must be in jobs. Like, how empowered is a woman going to be in the boardroom if she's not empowered in the bedroom? We go on about these youth strategies and, young people are our future and we must give them the means to lead us into the bright new land. Okay, that's great. But on the other hand, you don't trust them with the information and the tools to lead their own intimate lives. It has to connect. And at the moment, the political space in the Arab world is very tricky. It's really hard to maneuver. We're in a tight spot after the Arab Spring. That's why it's important that we ask these questions and we challenge these taboos and received wisdoms in our private lives, because one day they are going to connect up to our public and political lives.
Yeah. Okay, I have just one message from our viewer that your book is amazing. So I just want to say it out loud. And now maybe we can ask our colleague Victor to play the video. But if you want to say something beforehand, something about the video that people want to know.
So I'm going to say, just anyone who has connections to Czech publishers, my book did not come out in Czech. If you love the book, very eager to hear from you if you know some classes that might be interested. Okay, so that's my selling, that's my pitch. This video we're going to show you. In 2019, I did a series of short movies based on the book about the sexual pioneers in the Middle East, people who are really pushing the boundaries of conversations, action, opening the space on sexuality. This video we're going to show you is a film which appeared on BBC Arabic. It's about a sexologist in Lebanon called Sandrine Atalla, and it really connects to the work that Nina is doing and that I'm doing on how do you also use social media to have the conversations online that we might not be able to have offline. So over to you, Victor.
أنا تعذبت تلاقي بنات نام معهم. ما ترددت إنه أدفع لبنات هوا، يعني ما ترددت. وكل ما أجي توصل للنشوة ما أقدر.
قديه كمية الشباب اللي بيجوا لعندي بيقولوا لي أنا عندي ضعف بالانتصاب، أنا عندي قصف مبكر، ما بيكون عندهم شيء، بس بيكون عندهم شك بحالهم، وأنا بقول لهم بس أنتوا بس تعلمتوا تمشوا، مشيتوا من أول مرة، كم مرة وقعتوا، الجنس نفس الشيء، بس مثل ما شفتوا بعده كل جسم النظر موجود. أنا بس بلشت شغل من 11 سنة بلبنان، كان الحكي عن الجنس كتير صعب، فبلشت ببرنامج على التي في اللي أكتر فتح الآفاق وفتح تنقول على الأشخاص أفكار جديدة.
شو هو التوبيك تجي؟
أنا كنت عم فكر anal sex و dirty talk. مرحبا، اليوم رح نحكي عن موضوع كتير تابو بس عم يجي كتير أسئلة. أنا عندي شاب بتجي لعندي متزوجة صار لها 2 سنين، وكل ما بتجي توصل للنشوة بتحس إنه عم تعمل شيء كتير غلط، كتير ممنوع، لأنه هي وصغيرة لقطتها ستة عم بتمارس التحفيز الذاتي، فمن وقتها منعت حالها أنها توصل للثة، وهلأ هي مزوجة ما عم تقدر تحس بالنشوة، ما عم تقدر تحس باللذة الجنسية مع زوجها، لأنه هيك انزرع هالممنوع باللاوعي تبعولها.
شفناك امبارح على اليوتيوب
انستا درت اللايف. ايه عنا لايف اليوم كمان على 7:30 عن الليسته الجنسيه.
عندنا سؤال مهم جدا جالنا دلوقتي على الانبوكس، بيقول كيف يمكن إثارة الشريكة المختنة؟
فيها تحس انه مش قادرة تنبسط مع هالجسم لانه هالجسم مشوه، هالجسم ناقص، كأنه هي مش مرأة، كأنه هي ناقصة. هون العلاج النفسي كتير بيساعد، كمان تقدر تتقبل نفسها، تقدر تستمتع مع جسمها. عن جد هون بنشوف قد ايه الصمت والتابو عم يمنع الاشخاص انها تقدر تستمتع بصحة. ما عم نحكي حتى انه تتفزلك بحياتها الجنسية.
It was very good.
So I would like to thank you to our audience and give the space to Shereen for the last time. If you have some final thoughts or takeaways for us or anything you want to say.
I just want to thank everyone and thank you for your interest. Thank you for the excellent questions. If you have any further questions, please email me if you're interested in more information about HIV in your world or in the Arab world. Very happy to oblige as well. But what I really like to leave you with the sense is that I know there are cultural tensions between East and West. But I hope that you go away from this conversation thinking that they're not a million miles away. People who are living in the Arab region have dreams, have desires, have fears, have anxieties that we all share, and we're all trying to move to a better place in our intimate lives. And I think if you realize and appreciate that commonality, then this is for all of us a job well done. And I just want to thank you, Nina, for the excellent questions, you, Michaela, for the invitation, and for Victor for making this technologically possible, and to you, the audience, for tuning in. Many thanks.
Thank you.
Thank you, both of you, on behalf of the whole team of ARABFEST, and thank you, our public and our viewers, and for the questions, because I believe it was very interesting topic for all of you. And I believe that many questions, maybe you will have it later, so you can keep touch with us, and we can ask Shereen and Nina later on. So thank you all, and see you on other festival events. As a great Saturday program this weekend, concert, hafla, and festival in Prague. Thank you for your interest, and hopefully see you again, Shereen and Nina. And you are amazing. And just let me make a wish to have your book in Czech Republic available again, and have it in Czech translation maybe as well.
Inshallah.
Inshallah. Okay, great. So see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Have a good evening. Bye-bye.